What is going on, YouTube? I did a video yesterday talking on kind of an initial round of ideas of where I feel like some of the 8 Big 12 teams remaining could go, with Texas and OU likely headed for the SEC. I wanted to do the same, kind of the same sort of idea on Big 12 conference expansion, realignment. I had mentioned in the video yesterday that it's a whole nother conversation if you want to, kind of start that or restart that discussion of Big 12 expansion. So I've compiled a list of 10 teams. We've got some honorable mentions here as well of those who I feel could be part of any strategic expansion of the Big 12. Now, before I get into the specific teams, there's 2 things I do want to mention because it helps kind of clarify a lot of the reasons why I have certain teams on this list. The first thing is how I kind of see the Big 12 expanding. You can go 2 routes, I think. I think adding 2 schools just to tread water with 10 would be more of a short-term play, maybe to help just get this money out of Texas and OU that's owed to the 8 existing Big 12 schools, around $150 million in total. I see them realistically going the route of either 12 or 16. 4 16-team super conferences is the idea if the Big 12 does fold, and then every other power conference kind of scoops up the leftovers. If the Big 12 does try to stick around, I think there's a route where you could almost take more of a basketball approach than football first. There is a way there that the Big 12 can market itself, kind of hold a niche that maybe outside of the ACC, no other conference has. The SEC is definitely, obviously, not a basketball first conference, so you would have the edge over them in that regard. It's something. It's something to play off of. Now, the second thing is the schools that I feel like would actually lead the charge if this whole idea of conference expansion were to come about and the schools didn't just bolt for whatever greener pastures lie for each of the 8. I think that it would be largely up to, I think, a package of 4 schools to make this happen. And I think it's mostly the ones that don't have an easy route to another conference, but also are probably getting calls from at least the ACC and the Pac-12, obviously the AAC. And that is a package of 4 schools that consists of Oklahoma State, Texas Tech, TCU, and Baylor. Now, each of those kind of has its own marketability. Each of them has its own drawbacks. I think Kansas, Iowa State, and West Virginia are the 3 schools that could easily find another home, either with the ACC or the Big 10. So I don't think that they would have the most motivation to try to hold this together. But I also think if you're looking at it from a perspective of, I actually think the school in the worst spot here is probably Kansas State. I think if you're looking at this from a Kansas State, and even in some regards, if the Big 10 doesn't want them in Iowa State perspective, then you kind of have the idea here that, that you don't really have any leverage. So why are any of the schools going to try to band together with you or rally around you? I think it's important to take that into account if those are the 4 schools kind of spearheading this charge, because I think that is one idea being thrown out there that, that kind of changes who some of the expansion candidates could be. So, anyway, let's get right into it. So I actually am in favor of the Big 12 going the 16-team route, just to try to get as many schools as you can, try to establish yourself maybe just in terms of quantity, still as a major conference, and maybe fend off someone like the AAC from, trying to become even more prominent than the Big 12, because on paper right now, the AAC doesn't look a whole lot different from the Big 12 with the 8 remaining schools. So let's jump right into it. I'm actually going to go in order here of honorable mention, then 10 through 1 from least to most desirable for the Big 12. Again, with the approach of hoops first, with potentially 16 teams split up into 2 divisions, North and South. So let's go ahead and get on into the honorable mentions. I got 6 of them here, each for their own reason, most of them for just individual appeal, usually in one or two forms. So first we got Air Force. Air Force is, Air Force is an appealing institution just in the sense of obviously the academic prestige, one of the service academies. I actually think if you were to go to Air Force, I kind of have a sub-honorable mention here. It makes sense to also try to bring in someone like Colorado State and even Navy. You can form somewhat of a rivalry there, or at least a connection, if not geographic, between Colorado State. You have the service academy connection between Navy and Air Force. So I think that's a viability, but Navy's pretty strong in football recently. Granted, Army's kind of surpassed them, but over the past decade, maybe 2 decades, Navy's been the better of the two. Air Force, I think, has been more consistent. I believe they do still run the triple option offense. That, excuse my lack of knowing that there. But I think that it's a unique presence that you could bring. You bring the Colorado market back into the Big 12, so I think that's an option. Colorado State is another one of my honorable mentions. I think, again, bringing in that Colorado market, you could connect those two between Air Force and Colorado State. And Colorado is close to a lot of the Big 12 schools as is. I think there's potential with that program. I think there's a route where you kind of have that connection even with the Buffaloes. So maybe eventually bring them back into the mix. I think that's just one part of the conversation. One of the more intriguing ones that I think there is, and they would be in my top 10 if I was taking a football first approach to taking on this Big 12 expansion discussion. North Dakota State. I think North Dakota State, if you're going to expand north and you're going to have North and South divisions, does make sense. It kind of gives the Big 12 unique edge, helps them think outside the box. Obviously, North Dakota State's a team that's even got votes in the AP top 25 as a FCS school. So, it'd be interesting. You get a very unique fan base, but also a strong one at that. And who knows, a few years could be a competitive FBS program, kind of like App State or Coastal in a sense. Tulsa is my next one up. Tulsa, I think, has potential. They have academic prestige. They have a decent basketball program that's made the tournament a number of times in the past decade, I think more often than not. But I think you have a set ceiling with Tulsa. I think you're really kind of digging deep. I would keep Tulsa as one of the last options, but also think among the group of 5 programs, they have one of the higher floors just for the football and the basketball programs. And again, you get that edge of academic prestige. It's right in the middle of Oklahoma and the geographic proximity is there. So that makes sense. Tulane is another one, and I'll get into it in a bit, but I think there's obviously a geographic connection here. Any sort of recruiting pipeline that you would hope to keep alive or TV market in Louisiana could stay alive if you have Tulane. Obviously that gives you some part of the New Orleans market. Granted, LSU still kind of runs that. But I think that's an avenue back into peeling some market share and some recruiting away from the SEC. Not a huge amount, but again, any sort of edge there would help. Tulane, new stadium. I think the football program has potential. It's been better in the past few years. So I think that's certainly an option. Again, just like Tulsa, you got that academic prestige too. And the last of the honorable mentions is USF. I think USF was a more viable candidate maybe 5 or 6 years ago in kind of that last round of conference realignment conversation where nothing really came about from it. The idea of a package deal of USF and UCF sounded very nice. I think you got to see a little bit more life out of USF for their football program and just a little bit more investment in athletics across the board. Because as it stands now, I don't like USF as an expansion candidate. Beside the geographic connection, maybe the package deal with UCF. Okay, so I'm going to get into the top 10 here. And actually, even the first one comes with an asterisk. My first one in the top 10 is Coastal Carolina and Appalachian State. So I know that kind of works as a 10-11 or a 9-10. But I really like the idea if you're just going to kind of throw geographic proximity out the window here and expand east, that you can kind of tap into the Carolina markets and that pipeline of football and basketball talent. App State's a weakness in basketball for sure. Coastal's not a bad basketball program. They're one that has competed in the Sun Belt recently. They're one of the better programs there. They've actually developed talent rather well. And the school as a whole, I think, is completely overlooked in terms of just the unit of basketball, football, and baseball, how much they bring to the table. One of the best group of 5 programs last year in football. Clearly, baseball won a College World Series a few years ago. I think there's viability there. App State obviously brings another unique market to the table. Clearly could be a Power 5 level school. They've been the best football program in North Carolina at at times in the past decade. And I think that could be a unique approach to tapping into a new market. In the Big 12 here, you're going to have to take a different approach here to find an edge. And I think adding the duo of Coastal and App State, while my basketball first approach here pushes that further down the list, I really like the potential of that. Okay, so number 9, again, you're going to need more investment in the basketball program here. This is why they are so far down the list. This one does still take more of a football first and overall academics and athletic investment approach. But I have Louisiana. If you asked me 5 years ago about the viability of adding Louisiana, I would have drawn that back. I would have turned that down completely. But I think now, with them looking like a sustainable group of 5 power, maybe not on a national basis, but they're preseason top 25 team. I could see that holding true for the next 5-10 years, but we'll see. The school's done a lot of rebranding. It's invested a ton around the football program. It's got a very strong baseball program. I think there's similarities there in terms of the marketability between Louisiana and Coastal. And again, you keep that market alive in Louisiana, so that adds that edge there, brings in a little, a different revenue stream to the conference. If you're adding 16 teams, I know the Raging Cajuns aren't a team or school that are mentioned a whole lot with Big 12 expansion. I definitely think it's one worth considering. And then if you run into trouble with not being able to add another 8 or 4, whatever you're trying to do there, depending on what number you're trying to get to for the Big 12, then I think you have the option of also packaging in Tulane to try to capture more of that Louisiana market, and you still kind of keep the geographic proximity alive with Texas and Oklahoma. Just as states, not obviously with the schools moving to the SEC. Go on to number 8, and this is where you kind of get into the meat and bones of what I was talking about with the basketball expansion, or with basketball being the main focus of expansion. And I have Yukon. Yukon's been mentioned as a potential school to reach out to and see for basketball expansion and just conference expansion in general. Unfortunately for the Big 12, if you bring in Yukon, you have 2 complete doormats of football programs now in Kansas and Yukon, but you also have 2 of the most storied basketball programs in the entire country. So you're really throwing away, in a way, the football prestige for basketball. But again, that's the approach I'm trying to take here. And I think the willingness could be there from Yukon, if they are in a power conference, to invest more in the football program, to at least get it up to maybe a school that can compete for a bowl game every year, at least be better than like a Rutgers or a Kansas. Number 7, I've got UCF. UCF is a school that's been better in basketball in the past 5 years, and they've remained as one of the best group of 5 football programs. I think enrollment-wise, they're the largest school in the country. You get the Orlando TV market. There's a lot of obvious draw points to UCF. My biggest drawback from them is still, again, if you're taking the basketball first approach, then it's a respectable program. But for me to have them in my top 8, I was usually looking for more of a basketball emphasis. I think it's worth taking them on. And again, you've seen life out of the basketball program in the past 5 years. I think it's definitely enough to try to bring them on. And again, you get to tap into the Florida market. That's an obvious draw point that you don't get if you don't add someone like a UCF or USF. And number 6, I've got SMU. SMU for me is less of an obvious choice than I think it is for a lot of people. As the Big 12, in the Big 12, you already hold the Dallas market for the most part. I mean, if A&M and Texas are both in the SEC, then there's going to be that slice of the Dallas market. And also for DFW, for recruiting purposes, a lot of your top talent's still going to go to Texas, Texas A&M at that point, Alabama, LSU, Georgia, all those type of schools, OU, of course. But you still got TCU, you still have Baylor, you still have Tech, you still have Oklahoma State. If you add SMU into the mix and SMU keeps rising as a basketball and football school, then that's going to be a really solid addition. You're going to have a staple to the Dallas market. You're going to have the 2 biggest schools in terms of athletics in the Metroplex, in TCU and SMU, and one that's just like an hour and a half away in Baylor, that all 3 could be pretty solid for the foreseeable future. From almost all angles, academics, I guess unless you're looking at baseball maybe, but from academics, football, of late, basketball, SMU looks like a solid addition. And number 5, I've got a really obvious one in my mind, and that's Cincinnati. If you're to add Yukon, I think Cincinnati would have to be a no-brainer for the Big 12. Cincinnati is a school that obviously has ascended in football recently. They've gotten better in basketball after losing Mick Cronin. They're still one of the more storied men's hoops programs of the past few decades. You get that Ohio market. You can kind of take a slice of that away from the Big Ten. You kind of start moving into the Midwest, the Northeast in that sense. If you have still Iowa State, West Virginia, and then you get Yukon and Cincinnati into the mix, then the Big 12 gets more of a national footprint. Again, money, recruiting, all that good stuff. It really helps you out there. Number 4, I've got Memphis. Memphis, you do get to tap into a new TV market in a sense with West Tennessee. I don't know how much new recruiting grounds you're going to get out of getting Memphis. You get a little bit out of West Tennessee, but that's pretty firm SEC territory. But again, Memphis is a lot of the same argument that you would have out of Cincinnati or SMU. Memphis is a solid football program. Over the past few decades, a solid basketball program. Penny Hardaway looks to have that program headed in the right direction. They are at the very forefront of basketball recruiting the last few cycles, despite I think some scandals and some of the players not sticking, but that will happen. I'll be honest, that's a drawback, but Memphis looks like a solid addition. Geographically, it makes sense. It's an easy fit into a North or South division, wherever you want to move them off to. And if they sustain this level of football and basketball success for the next decade, I think that's an obvious win for the Big 12. Moving into the top 3, and this is the last school I have on the list that, again, could still be a little bit of a drawback in terms of basketball, but I think the rest of their appeal would be enough for the Big 12 to overcome, if you're taking this basketball first approach, overcome just ignoring them as an expansion candidate, and that's Boise State. I think Boise State is a school that's often brought up in the Big 12 expansion conversation. Going back like a decade, at least in my mind as I've thought about it, Boise State has made sense to some degree if you're splitting into North and South divisions, and you're looking to bring on any school north of Kansas. Even if not, I think that Boise State, again, gets you an edge. Pac-12, if they don't expand here and don't pick up any of these Big 12 schools, then I think that's an area where you can take an edge away from the Pac-12. And obviously a strong football program. It's a strong brand as a whole for a Group of Five program. The academics, from what I've seen, what I've researched, basketball, again, not so great. But if you're just taking this on for brand, for new recruiting pipeline, TV money, again, you get a very unique addition in Boise State that I think is almost impossible to overlook if you're taking this approach that I'm taking here of adding 8 more teams and doubling the size of the conference as it stands now. And then my top 2, I think, are shoo-ins. No matter what, I think you have to add Houston as 1 and BYU as 2. I'll start with Houston first, though. There's been mentions before of if you have Texas already. If you have Texas, you have Texas Tech, you have Baylor, you have TCU, Texas A&M in the SEC. It's a hard market to win over if you're just trying to get the Houston TV market by bringing in Houston, because there's just too many more powers that kind of overshadow them. Now, I think if you're looking at a situation where Texas and Texas A&M are both in the SEC, Houston makes a lot more sense. Houston's proven before that it can recruit well. It is a football program that has a lot of potential. We'll see where it goes in the next few years. Under Dana Holgerson took a bit of a dip, but overall, I think it's a strong football program that could compete at a Power 5 level. The basketball program's been very good in the past few years. And if that can sustain, then this basketball first approach works out amazingly well by adding Houston. Again, geographically, it makes sense. I think if you're trying to uphold any sort of geographic relevance here with, again, those 4 schools I was talking about, Oklahoma State, TCU, Baylor, and Texas Tech as kind of the staples of leading this expansion and trying to hold this conference together, I think Houston is a shoo-in for an addition at this point. And then number 1, I think that this should be the first call that the Big 12 makes, because it makes sense as a power conference program. And outside of Notre Dame, it's the strongest independent is BYU. Potential for the basketball program, the academics. If you get Boise State, then it has a geographic proximity there. You tap into the Utah TV market, again, more to take away from the Pac-12. That establishes kind of that new competition there that I think would have a lot of potential for a win for the Big 12. I think that BYU and Houston should be the first 2 calls that the Big 12 makes, without a doubt. I think that there's appeal for these other ideas in the top 10, but if you're expanding with 8, then and you don't get someone like a BYU or a Houston, then it greatly impacts how the rest of your conference is going to look. Again, even if you're taking a football first approach, BYU should be the first call, probably, if you're among the group of 5 or independent programs. If you're taking a basketball first approach, I still think BYU should be one of your first calls, just for brand just recognition and marketability, money, all that stuff. BYU gives you an edge. It's something to build off of. It's something to say, okay, we're not looking great right now on paper with the 8 schools remaining in the Big 12. We look a little bit like the AAC. It helps you elevate yourself, put yourself one step ahead of the AAC and get yourself closer to, I guess, even the Pac-12. I think if you do this right, you do have the ability in 4 or 5 years to once again surpass the Pac-12, at least in basketball and maybe in overall sports. It's going to be hard in football if your main name brands are going to be like Oklahoma State and West Virginia, TCU, Baylor, Texas Tech, compared to someone like a conference that has UCLA, Washington, Oregon, USC. But you got to start somewhere. And like I said, that's why I think taking the basketball first approach could have a nice niche to it, because if you take that approach, you add schools like BYU, like Houston, Memphis, Cincinnati, SMU, Yukon, then you have a conference that could compete at a much higher level on the court than the Pac-12. You have one that realistically could be better than the Big Ten. I mean, you still got Kansas, you still got Baylor, West Virginia, Iowa State, Oklahoma State's been strong recently. TCU's been strong at times. Texas Tech's been really strong. Like, I think you could still have an edge over the Big Ten, depending on how, like Ohio State, Michigan State, Maryland, depending on how some of those programs shake out. So I think taking the basketball first approach is a good way to go. The good thing for the Big 12 is there are some appealing candidates out there. And honestly, the SEC getting Texas and OU creates such a huge gap between them and the next best conference. I guess at this point you would have to say the Big Ten, maybe the ACC, that you could at least keep yourself in this power conference conversation and maybe be the 4th best conference, depending on how football trends in the next few years. Anyway, that's pretty much it. I wanted to do a fairly in-depth video on that because I still think that the options there, the Big 12 tries to stick together. The problem with that's going to be the second that even one school gets a call from the Big 10 or the ACC and is like, yeah, let's do it. Let's go. Like, say Kansas just tomorrow, or Iowa State gets the call from the Big 10 and goes. That takes the financial motivation away from all of this. And I think the rest just falls apart. There's like $150 million at stake here for these 8 schools that Texas and OU owes them. That's a good chunk of change. I mean, that's going to be roughly the same, if not more, than what you get in revenues from the conference on a yearly basis anyway. But the second that the plug is pulled on that, I think the rest of the schools scatter. So this is certainly an option. We'll see kind of how this plays out. I mentioned yesterday in a video kind of all the options, or at least the best options, are most realistic for each of the 8 schools remaining. And I'll try to cover this as time goes along. I mostly cover this from the Texas perspective, so it's nice to branch out a little bit. I do cover the Longhorns, so there's obviously a lot going there with the SEC movement, but I'm an Oklahoma State fan, so there's still that allegiance there too. So anyway, that's pretty much it. I always enjoy looking through the comments, what everyone has to say on this matter. I know that a ton of people have an opinion on what will happen with the Big 12, about Texas and OU going to the SEC. So like I said, that's always a fun and long conversation to be had. Anyway, that's pretty much it. See ya.